This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the first week of April 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio, and the UFC is in the midst of a 2-week hiatus, but still plenty of MMA action and news to discuss. So let us get right into it. And interesting about this week's panel, this quartet has never been together. This is the first time that at least these three have done a show together, so I'm interested to see how this show plays out. Of course, you know this man. He is Luke Thomas of MMA Fighting.com. He is back. Also back is Mark Ramundi of FoxSports.com. And wow, how about this?
What's up?
He hasn't been with us for months, if not a year.
The time is now.
Yes. Jack Encarnacio of the SureDog.com. Rewind. Great to have you back.
Step into our world, Jack.
Hashtag.
Yes.
Can Jack can come back. GSP can come back.
Absolutely. Sure. And we will talk about that in a bit. Great to have you guys here, and so much to discuss, so let us get right into it. So the first big news that I want to talk about is Jon Jones apparently requesting to have both himself and Glover Teixeira drug tested prior to their fight at UFC 172 later on this month. He asked the UFC for this. The UFC obliged. They're paying. And of course, the Maryland Commission is, all too happy to have an independent lab go out there and do random drug testing for both Glover and Jon. What do you make of another champion now asking the UFC to do random drug testing before a big fight?
Well, it wouldn't happen without that, which is to say, I was actually there, I believe in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, when Nick Lembo and other figures were arguing before the Maryland State Legislature to get a commission set up. And they simply don't have the practical resources or know how to do anything even approximately like this. So in the absence of the proactive urging of Jon Jones, this wouldn't take place at all. So we have to sort of acknowledge that. You know, listen, it has a lot of benefits, and this stuff can work. Lamont Peterson out of D.C. requested through VADA independent testing for before his rematch with Amir Khan, and he popped positive for various forms of testosterone. So even guys who request it sometimes can run afoul of the regulation. So I wouldn't be so quick to say that this is him on a witch hunt for his opponents. It has real value. But at the same time, you know, and kudos to the UFC for paying for it. But my whole view is like, listen, it's great that we have champions requesting this, but that's all we have requesting this. Like, is the UFC going to pay for this for the Maximo Blanco Andy Ogle fight? It's not going to happen at all. They'll do other forms of testing, I hope, but this kind of rigorous testing, this next level stuff, is really reserved for the champions and the champions who then request it. Otherwise, I don't know that this really has any larger effect.
When this news came out, guys, I was very surprised by the reaction by the fans who were saying, oh, why should Jon Jones be applauded for this? This is not random drug testing. He's asking for this test to be done. And it was a lot different than GSP when he went on his little, crusade a couple months ago. And to me, it was just like, man, no one wants to give Jon Jones any credit. The guy's trying to do something good for the sport, and they're always trying to nitpick. What was your take when you found out that he asked for it? He doesn't know when he'll be tested. He just wanted it to be done before the fight.
No, it's great that he's asking for it. I mean, this is a positive step for our sport. Like Luke was saying, like, the UFC is probably not going to test Andy Ogle. Who's Andy Ogle? The UFC is probably not going to test the lower level guys, but the fact that champions are coming out and asking for it is a great thing. However, the word random, it's not random. I mean, if you ask for something, it's not random. If you ask your wife for an Xbox One, and then next week she brings you an Xbox One, and you say, oh, it's a random gift. No, it's not a random gift. You asked for it. You asked for it last week.
But he doesn't know when the test is going to happen.
Granted, he doesn't know exactly when it's going to happen, but he knows it's going to happen before the fight, sometime before the fight. And what are we, like, 4 weeks out now? Something like that, 3 weeks out. So he knows it's going to happen. He asked for it. So it's not a random test.
Well, but then you demonstrate that you can get through a training camp at the highest level, defend your championship without being caught with anything in your system by not really knowing what day they're going to show up. You give a window. Ostensibly, that's how WADA does it. That's how the Olympics do it. You give an hour every day, 7 days a week, that they can expect for you to show up and take your samples, and you don't necessarily know. You can't do anything and mask it necessarily. There's a way to microdose so that your system is clear, but that's a lot of trouble to go to. You'd rather just not request it. That's what this has to be, like Luke was saying. Floyd Mayweather was very much at the vanguard of this, and just like Jon Jones, because Floyd Mayweather is primarily a heel, people disliked it because they dislike Floyd Mayweather, they dislike his posture, his disposition. They can't deal with what Floyd Mayweather presents to them. And it's the same thing with Jon Jones. They can't deal with what he represents, which is superiority in terms of in-cage ability. His ability to manage what he says and where he says it and how he says it might be off kilter and off center sometimes, and he clearly hasn't sunken in with the general public as the face of mixed martial arts. But those personality points being imbued into what he does reminds me precisely of Floyd Mayweather, who's been the crusader for clean boxing. I mean, he was coming up with this kind of a panel for the Shane Mosley fight and others. This is the way to do it. Like Luke was saying, it has to be the stars driving it.
And also, Johnny Hendricks fought tooth and nail against George St-Pierre to not do this kind of thing. I mean, it was a different thing. It was the VADA thing, but something relatively similar. And everyone was like, well, I sort of see Johnny Hendricks' exploit. Jon Jones goes out of his way. Imagine if he didn't do this. Imagine if he had resisted along the same lines that Johnny had. You think he would have gotten the same pass that Johnny did? It's ridiculous. You know, how much of this, I will maintain, personally, my own opinion, I do think a lot of this is racially charged. It's hard for me to not see that. But nevertheless, I think that to your point, it's not year-round random, where that's the real deal Holyfield. Okay, fair enough. But
I'm not knocking Jon Jones. I'm just saying it's only one very small step in the right direction for the UFC as a whole.
It's random in a tight window.
I think it's great that he's asking for it, but it's not quote unquote random because he kind of knows it's going to happen.
But if no one else is going to push the issue, at least he's taking the initiative to do so. But I just don't understand this reaction. I was blown away, and what it led me to believe was, at the end of the day, the fans really don't care who's using what. They just want to see the fights. Because I thought the reaction would be, let's applaud this guy for coming out there and saying, I want to be tested, and I want my opponent to be tested.
Really? Jon Jones?
No,
I did a little bit.
Did you?
When I was there,
I wasn't surprised that there was a split reaction. I was surprised that there was a majority hostility.
Majority hostility.
That's what I couldn't.
Everything's through the lens of the personality of the fighter.
Sure.
Everything. That's why Nick Diaz can get a title shot tomorrow.
Right. It's also a weird thing that, if someone pops positive before a fight and fans don't get to see that fight, fans will be upset about that.
Yeah.
So they don't even want this to happen. Leave me alone with all this.
As soon as it cancels one of their beloved pay-per-view main events, suddenly the stand isn't worth taking anymore.
You might be a fan, who has tickets to this event in Baltimore, going to your first UFC event. You're like, Jon Jones, shut up. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to ruin my main event? So I guess I could understand it from that vantage point. But for people to say, like yourself, that this is not random, if you're going to the Olympics, you know you're going to be tested at some point. You just don't know when. So how is this any different?
Right. Ronda Rousey was saying you had to be careful taking Motrin when you were training for the.
It's coming. You just don't know when. So how is this any different?
It's not. And I think that I understand that the fans, if you buy a ticket, damn it, you want to see the fight. Well, first of all, some fans were complaining that he had chosen Teixeira, right? And instead of sort of really pushing him for himself a rematch with Gustafsson, that was one thing. Second thing I thought was to me, it's like a little bit of the continued commoditization of fighters. It's like, oh, is their health in jeopardy? Okay, well, as long as they can continue fighting, I don't really care. Oh, are they going to potentially lose out on money with sponsorship through changes in laws? You know what? As long as me, Mr. Consumer, me, as long as I'm satisfied, then it's satisfied. And I feel like Jon Jones is at least helping to push the issue, set some parameters, create some precedents, and maybe there'll be more in the future, but it's good enough for now.
One of the things I am worried about with this, though, is that it's going to mask potentially a weak program that we don't know any details about. How precisely will the blood and urine samples be screened? For what? What tests will be imposed upon them? I'm not saying I have complete technical knowledge to appreciate what that is or isn't, but put it out there for the public to consume. Let people who understand biochemistry take a look at whether what they're going to actually do with this blood and urine is best practices. I noted that Jon Jones, in doing interviews about this process, said, they tested me for HGH. I think it was HGH. Was it or wasn't it? Is there really a reliable HGH test out there? WADA insists that there is, but very, very few Olympic athletes have been caught through this HGH process. I mean, we're talking a handful. And in general, the cultural belief is that HGH is one of the more abused performance-enhancing drugs in pro sports, mixed martial arts included. Now, whether there's actually performance-enhancing benefits to HGH is up for debate, but it certainly seems to help you recoup from injuries faster and magnify the effects of an anabolic steroid without being as detectable as the anabolic steroids. You can take the anabolic in smaller amounts and take the HGH to enhance the small amount you've taken. And that's the level of complexity we're dealing with here. So I think Maryland, and any commission that kind of follows an athlete's lead or the UFC's lead should disclose precisely what they're going to do with these samples in terms of what are we looking for. Are we doing the carbon isotope ratio tests, for example?
That is the big one. One more thing about this before we move on, I'll go to you, Mark. Are you worried that this might be a little bit of the inmates running the asylum, in the sense that this shouldn't be on the fighter's shoulders to go out there and say, I want this fight to be, a fight that's, drug tested beforehand and whatnot. It should always come from either the commission or the promotion, and now when guys are picking and choosing, it becomes a little messy. Are you worried about that?
No, because changes only come when a prominent fighter or a prominent athlete takes a stand. I mean, there wasn't free agency in Major League Baseball until Curt Flood said, I won't be traded. I won't be traded to the Philadelphia Phillies. He was firm and he didn't go. and he didn't win his case against MLB, but a few years later, someone else did, and then it went on from there, and then free agency became possible a few years after that. So, I mean, unless an athlete actually does it, I mean, it's still a business at the end of the day. You know, the UFC is a business, and you know they're going to try to take care of themselves first, and it takes someone to take a stand and to really to have progress. You know, to actually have something done.
Guys, last week on the show, none of you were here, but I was here, and we were talking about Daniel Cormier and Rafael Feijão.
MMA Beat, right?
I was, yes. Rafael Feijão Cavalcanti, and the panel wasn't all that excited about this fight. Well, a week later, the new fight in the works is Daniel Cormier versus Dan Henderson. Do you like this fight better than the Feijão fight?
Yes. It's a funny fight, you know. It's they didn't get a whole lot of juice out of the Olympian versus Olympian angle, or they got some juice out of the Olympian versus Olympian angle with Rousey and McMahon, but I think this is another case where they can really use that. There's a lot of credentials between the two, 4 Olympic teams, 92, 96, 04, and 08, and so that's kind of interesting, right? So, but really it's like a process of elimination. The only sort of weird factor here is where Phil Davis fits in, because if you look at the below Shogun in the rankings, boy, like light heavyweight is kind of nubs. Like there's not a lot going on past Shogun. Not to say those guys are poor fighters, but they're not even remotely in contention for title opportunities. Dan Henderson, with that win he had over Shogun, at least made him orbiting the space, which is enough to work with. Daniel Cormier, of course, they want to put him in the pipeline to make sure that they can get a fight with Jones or potentially Gustafsson. We'll see what happens. But you know, keep the top contenders always at a moment's notice and available to do that. To me, it feels like a blowout. But as our own colleague who's absent here, Chuck Mindenhall, noted on MMA Fighting, if you look at the rankings, which I know they are what they are, but fair enough, as some kind of crude measurement, they're only one space apart. And so, if not them, then who? The Phil Davis one, though, is interesting. I think it's a bit of an indictment on him. I know he's fighting Anthony Rumble Johnson, and I think what you've now seen is him begin to chirp a lot more than he used to. I think in part because he realizes if you're not blowing people's brains out, fight in, fight out, you better be chirping. And so we'll see what happens with that. But to me, it kind of works in a weird, sort of strange way.
I was told the stipulation on the table was the winner of this fight would be next in line for a title shot after Gustafsson. Right. I understand you're not a fan of this.
Only in MMA can you lose 3 fights in a row, get destroyed for 2 rounds, hit a guy with a punch, knock him out, and then all of a sudden you're in a title eliminator fight. Only in MMA that happens. And listen, I love Dan Henderson, but you know, at 43 years old in the year 2014, fighting in a #1 contender fight against Daniel Cormier, who's 8 years younger and undefeated and
still old himself though.
Still old himself, but he got a late start and possibly, arguably in his MMA prime right now. It's hard. It's a little hard to swallow. And like Luke said, I think that's a tough fight for Henderson. I don't think he's really in title contention anymore. I mean, he didn't even look good in that fight against Shogun. Yeah, he obviously hit him with that incredible punch. It was one of the best comebacks. But did he really look good in that fight? He got hurt real bad twice. He was close to being finished on 2 occasions. So that fight just like. It's better than Feijão, though, I think. Not a huge fan of that fight.
I think we can say that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to front. Dan Henderson is a star. He's tremendous to watch. He's slowed down significantly, which in a very odd and perverse way has added to how interesting he is to watch in some ways, as he even more desperately seeks the right hand. I care about Dan Henderson. I'm invested in his story, the story of his career, the point in his career that he's in. There are precious few guys in the roster that fit that bill, and that is why it just takes one punch to get a guy plugged back into the big picture in the spotlight, because there's just not that many guys that the fan in general cares enough about to be invested in what happens next in the long arc of their career. They're not sitting back with their arms folded saying, this guy still has to prove something, blah, blah. No, Dan Henderson doesn't have to prove anything anymore. That's a threshold that very few meet in this industry. And so, yeah, they're given levity, they're given leeway, they're given a much shorter hurdle to jump to get right back into the picture because people care about you. That is really the holy grail of MMA. You're trying to get people to care about you.
Mm-hmm. And the truth is, with Dan Henderson, I feel like, I certainly feel like we've turned a corner with Dan Henderson. For me, what I saw in that Shogun fight was that he's still very offensively capable, defensively not the same guy anymore, right? He can't take a shot like he did. Can still take a shot, but from the high bar that he had set, he's come down. He's a little bit slower. He'll be off TRT for this fight, which is also a notable little wrinkle.
First time in 7 years.
Yeah, which is a notable wrinkle. We'll see what happens there.
He didn't use TRT for the Winnipeg fight.
For shot.
Exactly.
Okay, it was a moment in time, but this is sort of ostensibly no going back, right? But the truth is, even if I feel like we've turned a corner with Henderson, his career has its peaks and its valleys. And goddamn, when he peaks, whoop, he peaks, man. Like, he comes out of nowhere and is the first guy to hold 2 major titles at the same time. And he comes out after just getting thrashed. I'm laughing saying it, by Jake Shields.
Right.
He gets thrashed by Jake Shields and then finishes his Strikeforce career on top, putting Fedor away. He's an unbelievable talent, and I think I feel like Daniel Cormier is going to just murder him. But I've thought a lot of people were going to murder Dan Henderson, and he really has an incredible ability to salvage bad portions of his career and, through perseverance, turn them into great ones.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, we were wondering what the UFC will do with the welterweight title picture now that Hendricks is out for a bit. And now, again, in the works is Tyron Woodley versus Rory MacDonald, and you'd have to think that that's a #1 contender fight. Do you like this fight? Is this the right answer? The winner of that fight fights Johnny Hendricks next.
I like that fight, but I think people are forgetting a little bit about Hector Lombard. I know some people are kind of down on his performance against Jake Shields. Personally, I don't get it, because who has ever done that to Jake Shields? I mean, Jake Shields is a stud.
Jake Ellenberger.
You know? But it was a quick, you know, flash knockout.
The asterisk is the tragedy with his father just a couple of weeks ago. But yes,
tell that to Jake Ellenberger, you know.
Absolutely.
Taking nothing away from Jake Ellenberger, but this was a prolonged domination of a guy who is a a long time contender.
His most impressive win, in my opinion.
No doubt about it. And he deserves to be at least in that conversation. You know, he's listen, at welterweight he looks real good, Lombard. But I don't have any problem with the Woodley MacDonald winner if that actually goes down. You know, getting the next fight. But you know, give Lombard someone good next. You know, he should be in that conversation. Like maybe like a Dong Hyun Kim. You know, two excellent judo guys going together and who can knock people out too. That might be interesting.
Perhaps, whenever we talk about matchmaking, I always end up making this point. You start with the date and the city and you work backwards.
You should.
You don't start with the fight and then try to find a place for it.
But that's the new UFC.
Right, well, sure.
Right.
But we've got a date in Vancouver. We've got Rory MacDonald. Okay, we put him. And how do we up the stakes for that fight? They were pushing Rory MacDonald on the broadcast right after Hendricks versus Lawler for no particular reason. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but they went out of their way to prepare that package for Joe Rogan to voice over right after Johnny Hendricks beat Robbie Lawler to put Rory MacDonald, who post Hector Lombard's win, no one was really thinking of in that moment, in that space and time, in terms of the 170-pound picture. They've got a date in Vancouver. They love to run, guys from TriStar who have profile when they go to Canada, and so let's up the stakes a little bit. Tyron Woodley feels he has a claim after the way the Carlos Condit fight went down. Circumstances. There's a million factors that go into why they make the fights they do, and whether a guy, quote unquote, deserves the fight is way further down on the list than we often enough remind ourselves. I mean, it's just way out in the outlier space. You know, you got your top 10 guys, and then you go to work based on circumstances, dates, venues, cities.
I actually think that you can solve the problem both ways. Which I think obviously what you're saying is I don't challenge in any way, but when you look at it, like why aren't people? There's a little more advocacy for Tyron Woodley. I think because one, I've never seen a guy as intelligently and effectively lobby for himself as Tyron Woodley. Goes out,
especially as of late, right?
Oh my God, man! Talk about a guy who gets media. Tyron Woodley gets it, right? So that has certainly helped his case. And then of course I can't think today. MacDonald's in the conversation because of other factors as well. But with Lombard, if you look at his finishes, he has 19, I believe 19 TKO or KO stoppages. 15 of those are in the first round, meaning he is a force of nature in the first round and then kind of flatlines and is not quite the same juggernaut for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds. I think people feel like if you can get past the front running, you still might lose, but what makes him himself goes away. It evaporates quickly. With Tyron Woodley and Rory MacDonald, if you take out Lawler because he just lost, so he's out there. If you take out Nick Diaz because he's not in the title picture, if you take out Lombard who's kind of behind everyone, it basically leaves, and Condit's injured, basically leaves Woodley and MacDonald. That's who's left. Yeah. And I think these are two guys. What makes it even better, and I could be like foisting upon a narrative that doesn't exist, but to wrap it up, for me, the kind of thing that you look at, these guys have had chapters in their careers. First 5 fights of Woodley's career all ended in submission. They made a bunch of decisions, and now he's blasting people. And it's quite the opposite for MacDonald. MacDonald was going in there blowing people out, and now he's got decisions. Who's going to turn that corner? Who's going to be that guy that wins the big fight to get to the title fight?
This is like
there's the countdown show.
This is you standing at a podium right now.
But this is what that is, man. Like everyone's career has an arc. Dan Henderson, the most notably. Yeah. They're arcing at the same moment, I feel like, and this is the one to decide it. And it dovetails perfectly with what he's talking about.
If you don't have to struggle,
fight.
if you don't have to struggle to tell yourself the story of a fight, it's a good fight from a business perspective. It's not always the pristine fight from a pure sport perspective. It's not the business we're in, folks. Never has been, won't be for a long, long time. I mean, come on, how many more? I don't want people to get ulcers about this. I feel bad for people to get worked up because they just constantly get slapped in the face by the matchmaking priorities. Dan Henderson, by the way, on Dan Cormier needs a legendary scalp to hold up before he can jump into that kind of picture and that consideration of being a top guy.
So Barnett, Bigfoot,
great
that
opponents.
Doesn't qualify.
I think they do in some ways, but I think in particular at 205,
right.
Dan Henderson fits the bill better than anybody. If Cormier runs over Dan Henderson, he is totally primed and ready in the UFC tradition of beating a star on the way to getting a title shot. That's how you make people care about your title match.
Now, Mark, speaking of tri-star fighters, late last week, very bizarre, just a little tweet. Hey guys, by the way, I tore my ACL and I'm gonna rehab and I'll be back better than ever. It was so bizarre. I mean, this is a major injury. And of course, we're talking about GSP. He had the ACL surgery just, a year and a half or so ago. He comes back from that. I mean, the guy's been through so much, says he's walking away from the sport, he's gonna relax, but still train, and he tears his ACL, blows his knee out while wrestling. And he's still going strong and still very much in shape and all that stuff. And he just sends out this tweet and then disappears. We see him, doing handstands on the beach in Miami.
TMZ, baby.
Hanging out with the futurist Jack Fresco. I mean, the guy's just living the life while, with an injured ACL. So what I'm wondering here is, does this really mean that this is it for GSP? I mean, can you come back from 2 ACL surgeries and multiple knee injuries? If you may have thought that he was going to come back prior to all of this, do you now believe there's no chance?
No, not necessarily. I don't think that will make too much of a difference. But by the way, he really is living it up, isn't he? He's hanging with Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's going to these Bacardi parties.
He looks huge too.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, he looks yoked.
But not fat.
No,
right?
No,
yeah.
I don't know, and sometimes look at Anderson Silva. Before the fight in December against Weidman, he was a little, I don't want to say unmotivated, but he was a little right after the fight in July. When he lost the belt, he was like,
right.
I don't want to fight for the belt anymore. There was rumors that he might retire. All of a sudden, he gets hurt. He breaks his leg in horrific fashion, and then the first thing he says is, I want to come back. And all he's saying is, I want to come back, I want to come back, I want to come back. So is there a competitiveness there that these guys have where this is another challenge that I need to overcome? And maybe GSP has that. Maybe it's I wasn't necessarily coming back. I don't really know what he's thinking, but I could see him saying people don't think I'm going to be able to do this. I'm going to go out and prove them wrong. I'm going to come back from 2 ACL surgeries.
So you think that this might have perhaps kicked it in a whole other gear? Like before he was maybe on the fence, and now do you agree with him that maybe this is the thing that he needed to really say, all right, now I have a goal, and once I pass this goal, okay, then I'll be ready. It'll be a year and a half or so.
It's hard to dance on crutches too when he's out of the club. So
yeah, that's true.
I have no idea if GSP needs some kind of spark to be lit under him. I doubt it, based on the body of his work. But I think in general, the story's already been told that GSP comes back from the ACL, the rebuilt GSP. So I'm not so sure the UFC would totally, I mean, if he was to fight again, of course they'd tell the story, they go back to that well. But what I can't really get my mind around is how far out GSP saw himself returning anyway, and if this actually puts it out much further. Did he ever intend on returning around the time he would be back in fighting shape from a surgery to begin with? Is this almost, in a very odd way, an opportune time for this injury based on what his mental timetable was? I think he's sitting back, he's waiting to see what shakes out and see if there's something that brings him across. Whenever Jose Aldo fights, Anthony Pettis texts Dana White because he can't watch Jose Aldo fight without thinking about fighting him. Is there that guy out there for GSP? One would think it's Johnny Hendricks. There's been indications that in fact it's Johnny Hendricks that does that. So if there's something GSP needs to push him back into the fray, I think it's a particular fighter, a particular guy that gets his blood boiling. I think of Gina Carano smirking at cage side when Cris Cyborg was destroying in Elite XC. And when they cut to her smirking, you knew that there was a genuine this is going to be massive if I fight this person or this woman. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, but I don't have the gauge on whether he planned on returning earlier than he'll be able to now as a result of this surgery. I wish I had that context, but GSP is such a closed book that you don't know. You really don't know what he's thinking. I'm sure if you were to see him tomorrow, he wouldn't even act like he's depressed at all, even though I
spoke to him 2
Yes.
days ago.
Yes.
Totally not depressed.
Yes.
The guy is having the time of his life. He said, I don't even need the surgery right now.
I don't need this knee.
Yeah.
Who needs a knee?
Jesus Christ. Well, that's amazing. I mean, it's any number of ways to look at it. We're sort of just opining from the outside here. I don't know how valuable that is. I would say, though, I never thought he was the same after that first surgery. I definitely don't feel like tearing your second ACL in your 30s, however minor or major. I guess I'm no medical doctor. I could be totally wrong. But for me, that is like a red flag to the nth degree. The explosion, the guy, I mean, for me, the high water mark for GSP as an athlete and a fighter was the Thiago Alves fight. You know, hitting, changing levels for a double, having the guy rip his hands off of you and switching to a knee pick, like, is so ridiculously athletic, high level like,
he also
it's
tore
amazing.
his quad in that fight.
Yeah, I can't even, if you know anything about wrestling, that was like, what he did was sublime. And I don't think he's ever been the same guy since that surgery. You know, not that he was bad, of course, he still maintained his title, but I just mean from that ridiculously high measurement, he hasn't come down. The thing I always wonder is, he's gonna wanna rehab himself to a degree where he maintains a consistent quality of life, right? A physical quality of life. And I wonder if that regimen he has to go through, that physical therapy, because he was training already, but when you're training on your own, man, like, you know, training on your own, going to McDonald's, training on your own, I'll skip the warm-ups today. You know, what does that mean, training on your own? So I'm sure he still trains hard, but not the same as it would before a fight. In fact, I'm sure it's not the same, because that was what got him in trouble in the first place, sort of with the mental overload. So is the physical therapy going to be the kind of structure he needs to reinvigorate him, or the kind of thing he's like, God, Jesus, I don't want to do this anymore. This is just not for me anymore, and I really don't know.
There's a lot of ACL tears in gymnastics. And one of the things that's been brand new to GSP's game in the last 2-3 years is him doing all these flips all over the place in this padded room somewhere. And I'm sure it adds a lot to his game, but the guy already has the best spring in his step in MMA. The guy already has impeccable timing, and that Thiago Alves fight, perfect example of him matching that timing with that athletic ability. You know, because nobody times the takedown better. You take a step forward and he's on your legs. The second you're off balance, he's taking you down. And that was a huge linchpin of his game, you know, especially being able to get your hands to come up so we can crowd you with strikes and then those legs are open. The second your hands come up, watch Carlos Condit just struggle to stay ahead of GSP, and that's after the rehab. The timing is still there, but with 2 ACL tears, there might be something that he's added to his camp that he might just have to tone way down on, because that's a red flag. I mean, you know, we hear about ACL tears all the time in MMA, but for it to happen to this guy, basically 3 times, because he injured one knee, compensation tore, that knee was already hurt, and then he goes and tears it. I consider it 3 serious knee injuries for GSP. There's something about his training that he has to adjust from a layman's perspective, you know.
Tremendous point. Actually, I spoke to someone very recently, anonymously, who's close to GSP, and said he always felt uncomfortable with the fact that he was doing this gymnastic stuff. He didn't like it, and you know, let GSP do his thing, but you know, now he's looking at what's happening. And
you said he tore wrestling, which I can believe.
But you know, who knows what that is?
Oh, you mean like the wear and tear?
Yeah. Who knows what you put your body through? So right now in the UFC, there's obviously no Anderson Silva, there's no GSP. Ronda Rousey is filming movies all over the place. Cain Velasquez rehabbing his shoulder. Anthony Pettis also coming off surgery. Chris Weidman just had 2 knee scopes, and that means UFC 173. It's Renan Burrell versus TJ Dillashaw. That's the main event. And when this news came out, the consensus from the fans was, oh my gosh, how is this a main event? You know, these guys aren't draws. This is for a title, but I'm going to skip this one. And I always hear these threats from the fans. I'm going to skip this one. And these guys, the ones who are saying it, are not going to skip it, I know. But,
and by the way, you would just throw the money out of your wallet for Sunsao versus Burrell, right?
Exactly.
Come on.
What do you make of this main event?
It was weird, man. Like, it was TJ Dillashaw. Who was he supposed to fight before this? Takeya Mizugaki, who is a credible...
Who's on a roll.
Of course. Yes. It's not that he's not a credible fighter, but Jesus Christ, to go from Mizugaki to Burrell, I mean, that's a stratospheric jump. And Dillashaw characterized it as Cinderella story. Okay, I'm not sure I understand that. And he even said on your show, he goes, I don't really know how to sell the fight, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to speak honestly. It's like, oh my God, man, they were digging deep into the well. Now, it's not even a knock on TJ Dillashaw. It's just an evidence of how wet behind the ears he is in terms of this process. You pull in maybe he and Uriah Faber are close in the gym. Maybe Dillashaw gets the edge because he's a little bit younger and he's really rounding out that talent with Dwayne Ludwig. But he doesn't know how to talk to the press like Uriah Faber. He admitted this is the first time he's on the main card of a pay-per-view.
Wow.
Just a guy that hasn't been introduced to the UFC fans in a transactional way.
Yes.
That's the key here for me. If you look at the card, the main event, okay, Renan Burrell is, I think, must-see viewing as an MMA fan. Yeah. And the rest of the card, not big names, but kind of important fights for those guys. And the division, you're like, you know what? That were a Fox card, that is must-see TV. But now that they're asking you to put it behind a paywall and to cross that paywall, that's when the whole dynamic for me shifts.
And when you look at the universe of bantamweight contenders and you consider that Asuncao was injured, it's actually sort of sensible that TJ Dillashaw would be the next available pick to fight the champion at this moment. This is what we say we want when we front about what we want in MMA fights. But you know, when you try to sell someone a pay-per-view main event of a guy who has never been in that light before and who has yet to really make us care. I know he's had tremendous performances. I know that TJ Dillashaw is a very gifted fighter, but the UFC has never decided to really tell us that in an over-the-top way. That's never been the circumstance that's been called for. So until you have that jump, people just don't really stomach you as a pay-per-view draw. It's just, there's a process, and the UFC is a master of it, really. I mean, the degree to which they've been able to keep the gears turning, while the pay-per-view numbers haven't been incredibly high, they do manage on a frequent enough basis to make you care about fights. It's actually kind of remarkable. But in terms of this, you know, who's supposed to fight Burrell? You know, when a main event falls through like this, especially one the caliber of Weidman and Machida, it's about saving the show. It's about putting something on there that will at least not make people want refunds who've bought tickets to the event.
And perhaps the issue is not so much that Dillashaw is deserving or undeserving of the title shot. It's that now this is the main event, you know, because in the past, you know, just a couple months ago, less than a couple months ago, it was Aldo and Lamas, Burrell and Cruz, then Faber. You know, Burrell wasn't on his own as a pay-per-view headliner. He was coupled with another, you know, title fight, and that was against Cruz or Faber. You know, two pretty big names in that weight class. Now he's just all by himself for the first time on pay-per-view as a headliner. And yes, you do have Junior Dos Santos in there, and they just added Robbie Lawler and Jake Ellenberger. But you know, could this be, in your opinion, perhaps the lowest pay-per-view buys of 2014 for the UFC?
It's possible. I mean, as Luke was saying, you know, the card has some interesting fights, but I mean, no one really knows who Renan Barão is. But if you're an MMA fan, how do you not watch the guy? You know, he's one of the pound-for-pound best fighters in the world, and he's so dynamic and he's so electric, and he just knocks people out. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to get the casual viewing, but when you have like 50 shows in 1 year, what can you do? I mean, you have to fill the, you know, you had an injury and you gotta fill the main event with something. What was a better option?
So do you fault the UFC for this one, or is it, you know, you just have to take these steps in order to build these guys, in order to make them seem like people that you have to pay for? You gotta take a step back.
That person.
Here's my thought. Like, I believe that there should be. If the UFC wants to do all these shows, I mean, clearly they don't take my advice at all. But they're going to do all these shows. Yes, that's a given. For me, I could see a case where they could dial back the number of pay-per-views, say to 8 or 9. And you would say, oh, this will fix the problem because you can have a few of these shows you're selling to people, you can make sure you can load up those cards. The reality, though, is you could still load up a card and then just be ravaged by injury. And no matter how few pay-per-views you do, you just get cursed. So that's the reality. But I do feel like, though, there's the stratification of shows from Fight Pass down to Fox Sports 1, down to Fox, down to pay-per-view. There are clear stratifications, but they're beginning to get a little blurry sometimes for me. To me, this is like a decent Fox, maybe decent to good Fox show. I understand they can't do anything about the pay-per-view. Canceling would be financially devastating. They're going to make money off of it if they sell 150,000 or maybe even less than that. They still make money. I get all the economics of it. But I do feel like, for me, I would like to see a little more quality control in differentiating the kind of shows that you get to make sure each one really feels like what it's supposed to feel like. This one doesn't. There's just no pay-per-view vibe to it, you know.
It's not the worst one they've done though in the last few years. I mean, there's still Junior Dos Santos on the. I'm just saying, you know.
It's a contender. It's very much in the hunt.
It's probably in the top.
Again, the
UFC 147 might take the cake.
The card is not
Aldo against.
No, UFC 147.
Franklin Silva?
Franklin Silva, and then the tough Brazil.
Okay, but again, everyone always mistakes. They look at the fight, they look at the card, and they're like, "Oh my God, it's X versus Y. That should be a good fight." That has nothing to do with whether it's promotionally viable.
Right.
It's got two completely different things. And the question is there substance there? I can go to you and say, "Give me money."
Right.
That's the issue.
And it's Memorial Day weekend, and the UFC has a custom of running Memorial Day weekend because it's a popular, long weekend for a lot of people in Vegas. They're going to run Memorial Weekend. They're going to run Independence Day weekend. They're going to run the last Saturday of December forever, no matter whether they have a fight or not. They're going to put something in that position because it's a very good time to run Vegas.
Very good point.
Super Bowl
Now,
weekend too. I don't know if you
Yeah,
mentioned.
yes.
Super Bowl weekend too.
Yeah, that's another tradition you'll always have.
last Friday in Las Vegas, a very rare sight, Cris Cyborg lost a fight. It wasn't an MMA fight, it was a Muay Thai fight, but she lost, and she looked somewhat vulnerable. She showed a tremendous amount of heart, came back. It was a thrilling bout. Even if you're not a Muay Thai fan, practitioner, you had to appreciate what went on in that ring. And now it comes at a curious time for her because, of course, she's in this position where she's trying to kind of get into the UFC, you'd think, now that she has parted ways with Tito Ortiz as her manager, although he was with her the entire weekend, and also has expressed interest in going down finally to 135. Does this hurt her stance? Does this hurt her negotiation with the UFC? Now that she lost the fight, it wasn't an MMA fight, it was against a great Muay Thai fighter, but it was still a loss, and she looked vulnerable.
MMA is so fighter dependent and circumstantial. You know, Ben Henderson goes to Abu Dhabi for ADCC 2013, gets armbarred via omoplata, actually, an omoplata armbar by Otavio Souza, and no one says a word. Oh, applaud Ben Henderson! What a G! And they should. And then Cyborg goes out there. She got just, I mean, steamrolled for the first 3 rounds. Had a better showing in the later rounds. Even landed one nice, crisp Superman punch. The only real takeaway should have been like, damn, Cyborg is tough. Holy crap! Her 3rd pro fight, she didn't get stopped against this lady, and kind of had a moment or two where she had her on her heels. That is incredibly impressive. But of course, MMA fans don't appreciate that. At least some of them don't, anyway. But it could be negative. There's enough material there where if her next steps in her career, both from on the Invicta side and her own side, could be really dramatic if she misses weight. If she misses weight and then loses. If she misses weight, loses, and then looks bad losing, where it's not even a split decision, where she just looked terrible. If, on the other hand, she goes and she makes weight, and she goes and she crushes her next 2 opponents, I think all will be forgiven.
Right.
So it really is dependent on the future, not the now.
But right now, do you think it hurts her?
I think that it gives the UFC more leverage, you know, if and when there are negotiations, because, you know, as Luke was saying, it's a completely different sport, and what she does in Muay Thai has no real bearing, technically speaking, in what she does in MMA, but there's the perspective thing. You know, MMA is all about perspective. It's about, you know, how good people think you are, not really now how good you are. And one of the things about Cyborg is that she had that specter of being like this unstoppable force, you know, this amazing, you know, unbeatable machine. So her name is Cyborg, you know. and now she went out and she lost, and she looks human. Granted, it was not MMA, it was Muay Thai, but there's a different dynamic there. She's not that same, you know, unstoppable, you know, force she was, and you know, she has less leverage now for sure. But I do agree with Luke. It'll depend on what happens next. You know, if she comes out and she steamrolls a couple girls in Invicta, she makes weight and she's clean and everything is good, then you know. But can we just make that fight happen at some point?
Which one are we talking about?
Just do it.
Cyborg
Rousey.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
thought you were talking. I just wanted to
What
make
other
clear.
Ronda fight could we be talking about?
Yeah, not Gina Carano.
I'm glad you said that, because what the fight that's in the offing is against the opposite of a striker. You know, I think Ronda Rousey's made gains with her hands, but I think it's pretty clear how she's going to approach this fight. I think it'd be different if the dream fight was Cyborg versus a kickboxer. If everybody was waiting for years for Cyborg versus Holly Holm, for example, and then she goes into a kickboxing fight, and when it comes to the subtleties of movement and limb placement and timing of a kickboxing fight, proves to have some deficiencies and just relying on strength and bullying forward. Just much like she does in the MMA cage, but you know, you can't. She hit as many takedowns as you can ever hit in a Muay Thai fight in that particular bout. Okay? The instinct is there, and she can't flush it out of her system, or she doesn't want to. Perhaps she thought that was a way to injure her opponent and gain an edge. But I think that's different. That the matchup that everybody's wanting to see is against an incredibly proficient and tremendously gifted submission artist is not going to take as much of a sting on the matchup than if she was to face a kickboxer, and you saw how she looked in kickboxing. I think that's part of the factor. But both you guys are totally right. One win at 135 in Invicta, everybody forgets it, because once you care about a fight once, you have to time it right to maximize that interest. If you don't time it right, you can lose a little bit of the edge of the fight, but people are always going to care about Cyborg versus Rousey whenever, however it gets made.
One has to think that there were a couple of smiley faces thrown around the Zuffa offices, Muay Thai or not, after that loss.
You know, like Cyborg is one of these creatures who has. She polarizes fans too, right? I mean, she does have some supporters, at least people who are interested in seeing her compete. On the other hand, people are like, she pop positive for performance-enhancing drugs. I hate her forever. You get a little bit of that dynamic too, but if you're a real fight fan, and I do mean this, I don't know how you watch that fight and don't walk away going, damn.
Yeah.
Urena Bars is a beast. Cyborg, the perseverance she showed, because I honestly, when she got neck kicked by Urena Bars in that first round and she did the old fish dance, I go, oh my God, she's going to get finished here. And she didn't. And to go 5 rounds with somebody that accomplished and to get a couple of licks in too, dude, I would, if I was Cyborg, I personally, I would walk away feeling like a victor there. That's about as best as you're going to do given the circumstances.
Guys, let's end on this one. Last Saturday night, I thought the biggest news of the weekend, you know, including the Cyborg loss, was Metamoris and that match, that main event match between Eddie Bravo and Royler Gracie, a rematch that was 11 years in the making, and the drama and how riveting it was and how thrilling it was. Even if you weren't a jiu-jitsu fan, it was just amazing theater. And then the aftermath, in my opinion, was almost as interesting, with the news of Royce Gracie confronting Eddie Bravo and Eddie Bravo's interviews afterwards, and just the way Metamoris has tried to apparently spin this into some kind of a moral victory for Royler when everyone thought it was a moral victory for Eddie Bravo, a moral victory for the Gracie family. And it is a little uncomfortable because Metamoris is kind of a Gracie promotion, you know, at the end of the day. And the question I was going to ask you guys was, you know, can they build off of this momentum, this buzz, this controversy, all that stuff? But the question I think that needs to be asked is, what kind of damage is the Gracie family doing to themselves? From Royce's antics to what they're doing now, spinning it. Is this bad what they're doing, or is this just?
It's unbelievably bad, and it's totally perfunctory, totally unnecessary, heaping it on themselves. I've never seen people own themselves this way. Like they don't have to answer to anybody. Royler didn't tap, and clearly the game has passed him by. The guy's 48 years old. To go in there and do what he did and not tap. Royler Gracie, multiple-time Abu Dhabi champion, multiple-time Pan Am champion, multiple-time in the gi, Mundial. His resume is set. That he even went out there and did as well as he did was sort of kind of incredible. It also vindicated, I think, in many ways, Eddie Bravo.
Sure.
But then to go out and it's petty. It's petty, not putting enough photos on the photo gallery of Eddie in dominant positions, saying the match was kind of even. Hilan Gracie and Henner Gracie doing the Gracie breakdown, barely paying any attention to what Eddie calls the vaporizer, and sort of saying, well, you know, I don't know that I've invented techniques, but I wouldn't take your techniques. They're not the same as Eddie's. Eddie's system is completely different, totally different. It's a heavy half guard, quarter guard, guard-based system. Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is something that has a lot of that in there, but a lot of stuff that's completely irrelevant. A lot of it's gi-based, a lot of it is very traditional. There was another Jiu-Jitsu, a well-respected competitor, who was even saying that both guys are in the past. And in fact, if you look at what Keenan does, and you look at what Hoffa does, they just bypass the guard altogether, like the Meow brothers do berimbolo. So like they're both kind of stuck in the past. But the reality is, the self-policing the Gracies do amongst each other, the censorship, it really is a bad look, and it doesn't matter because what they've done for MMA and Jiu-Jitsu, no one can ever take away. Why give people a reason to be give them a bad taste in their mouth?
So this goes back to my original question: does this hurt the growth of Metamoris, who really has emerged as the one kind of opportunity for jiu-jitsu to go to the next level? Does this behavior hurt them?
No. I mean, if Metamoris does another show, you know, just the same amount of people are going to look at it, not based on what Royce said. In fact, what the real limitation here is that Royce says he won't do a jiu-jitsu match with Eddie Bravo, which is just, what are you doing? You know, putting this out there, and creating this conflict if you're not going to resolve it.
Payoff.
You know, hey, if they can put an MMA fight together and just put the Metamoris fight on the cage, sounds like money to me. I mean, we joked earlier about step into our world. Step into the Gracie's world, where a Gracie has never really lost. I mean, this is a 50, 60, 70, 100-year-old story. Throughout the course of this family's history, whenever someone has trump-carded them or made a new revelation in technique or position or found a way to get around their tried and true, it's all mitigating circumstances. You know, Rorion Gracie, bless him, he's just incredibly influential and important in the history of this sport. You know, still to this day says that, you know, what the UFC represents is still the Gracie ideal. We brought jiu-jitsu to the table, and now everybody's using it, and everybody had to acknowledge it. So in a lot of ways, this is still tethered to what we did, when it's clearly, it's all anaerobics now. It's much more wrestling heavy. The kickbox, I mean, jiu-jitsu, hardly anybody gets submissions out of the guard anymore in MMA. Most of the submissions come after knockdowns.
Or even in pure jiu-jitsu. Arm bars from the guard and pure jiu-jitsu are almost unheard of.
Yeah, exactly. In pure jiu-jitsu, in the sport we're talking about, let alone in MMA, it's the Gracie experience. It's this Eddie Hoist thing is so 90s, and I love it. This kind of these dueling, these dueling systems. Between two guys who, if you saw them on the street, you think you could just push them over, and they wouldn't be able to offer much resistance. So but they're so devastating at choking you.
It's very Venice Beach, isn't it? It feels like there's these two factions.
Where's Hugo Duarte? Let's throw down on the shore. I'm ready. So I love it. I mean, it's just part of the Gracie story. And part of the Gracie story is when push comes to shove, the rubber meets the road, somebody kind of trump cards you a little bit, you just immediately go to work trying to recast it in the minds of Gracie defenders. I just think it's charming.
Final word?
What Jack was saying kind of reminds me of a story that Luke wrote a couple years ago about how the Gracies don't want BJJ in the Olympics.
Well,
because the community doesn't want it because they would kind of lose control over it in a sense, and there was a kind of an opportunity there for Metamoris to use this match because, like you said, there was the drama and the theatrics, and that's missing sometimes from jiu-jitsu, and people were taking notice of this, and it almost what the Gracies did kind of undermine that a little bit, and kind of and for Hoist not to say he won't take on Eddie in a jiu-jitsu match is kind of misses the point. I mean that's the point.
I know he had the final word. I have to say that because I want to make something clear. I love jiu-jitsu. I love jiu-jitsu. It's the one I don't do anything but work, hang out with my wife and dogs, and go. I don't do anything else. I don't do anything. I'm a loser. Okay. I drink. I also drink.
By the way, you didn't have to tell us that.
Yeah, don't isolate the I'm a loser.
But I'm the first person to tell you that jiu-jitsu will never be a spectator sport. It can be in small doses and done in the right way. Yeah. We felt that on Saturday. Yeah. But outside the Bravo Gracie dynamic, there's no other real rivalry like that in jiu-jitsu. I mean, there's teams that don't like each other's teams, but nothing that's pulled the MMA fan and the average person who just wants to see a dispute. Doesn't exist in jiu-jitsu. They don't interact that way. And the reality is, if you don't train or at least have a vague familiarity with grappling, you have no idea what you're looking at. The reality is, I'm not a big basketball fan, but it's easy to sit someone down and show them the basketball game with the round of 64 March Madness, and they get it like that. That doesn't work that way in jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu is a selfish endeavor about personal growth, personal development, self-defense, cardiovascular conditioning, and becoming something different. So I love it. I hope Metamoris has a big success, despite what they're doing with their Gracie stuff, but it's not a spectator sport.
Very immersive experience. It's very hard to casually consume high-level jiu-jitsu.
It's kind of like a lifestyle.
It is a lifestyle.
You can't even get together really with buddies and watch it at a bar. You need to have that commentary. You need to know precisely what it is these guys are angling for. The techniques evolve at such a rapid pace, and things are outmoded before most people even get a taste of what these guys are trying to do. I mean, you know how befuddled people were when Eddie dropped to his hip right away and went for the lockdown, right away as opposed.
Not that audience though.
No, but I mean in general.
Right,
I saw a lot of chatter of people like, what is he doing? And these are people who follow mixed martial arts religiously, very closely. Ostensibly they do. It appeared that way to me. So I mean, the education process is so unique. It's so unique in this sport, and it's so detailed and evolves so quickly. I mean, I do not envy whoever, if Metamoris were to get on cable, for example, I don't envy the job of the commentators, because it's very hard to communicate what it is that's exciting unless you're vested in jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu's always been that kind of community,
Fantastic stuff, guys.
I'm good.
Fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed the discussion. I think Jeff, Mike, Chuck have been put on notice.
Losers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so much for them.
Great to have you back. Great to have you back as well. And of course, great to have you back now. Let us know what you thought about anything we discussed on today's episode of the MMA Beat. So much happened in the last week, so we want to hear from you as always. And next week, the beat goes on. Another episode of the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com. Enjoyed this one very, very much. For Luke, Mark, Jack, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching the show right here on MMAfighting.com. We'll see you next week.